Hello, everyone. I'm Robbie Swale, and this is the 12-Minute Method podcast. And in this podcast, I'm going to be investigating how we can beat procrastination, be more productive, and finally do those things we have been meaning to do. And in season 1, what that means is I'm going to be reflecting on a number of things that I mostly first wrote about together in one place in the about the author section of the 12-Minute Method books, in book 1 in particular. These are things that over my life I have procrastinated on, thought I might not get done, and then finally done in the end. And in each episode, I'll spend up to 12 minutes reflecting on one of those things and sharing those reflections with you, hoping to identify patterns, things that you can use, ways that you can finally do the things that you've been meaning to do. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Coach's... It's not the Coach's Journey podcast, is it? That's so funny. I'm going to leave that in because that's the kind of podcast this is. Welcome back to the 12-Minute Method podcast. This episode, I even need to say that on this one because there's a pre-recorded intro. You can tell I've had a little gap between recording episodes for this show. And you can also tell that I've just listened back to episode 9 about the Coach's Journey podcast. And so, yeah, today I'm actually not going to... I promise that the books episode will happen at some point. But I remembered another thing that I've beaten procrastination to do. And one of the first, a really important thing that I thought that where the 12-minute method started to play out for me again. And so I'm gonna talk about that today, about reading. But before that, I'm going to reflect on episode 9. Just listen back to it, hence the smooth intro to this episode. What do I want to pull out? Well, I'm not going to talk about it in detail in one of these episodes, but I mentioned in passing in episode 9 that Warren Buffett story it might not be a real story, but James Clear, who wrote about it in his blog, I put a link to it in the last show notes, or if you Google Warren Buffett, James Clear, you'll find it. The article's called something, 2 lists, I think. That has been a really big part of how I've got things done. That story, I do that exercise usually for a calendar year. You could do it for the whole of your career. It's an idea. It's a story about saying yes to some things so you can saying no to something so you can say yes to something else. So check out that story. It's a great one. Or if you go to my website, it's in my time management article. I'll link to that in the show notes just because it's a great resource. So that was the first thing that stood out. The second thing was about detaching from was about how to get going, right? To start, give yourself permission to start small, to make it the most, I had a long list of guests for the Coach's Journey podcast, potential guests. I haven't invited all of them still, and we're 3 years later, partly because other things have come up and I slowed it down. But I started with the people I thought would be most fun and easiest and most relaxing and also as interest. So that was really important. That's the first part of it, because that's what helped me get going. And if we don't start, we don't have a thing. And I also caught that the way I talked about it, listening back, I tried to pick the ones that would be interesting without, which is a part of detaching from the outcome. So it's like, if I will have a fun, interesting conversation with somebody I am interested in, then it's worth doing. No matter what else happens, if anyone ever listens to it, really, all those things. So that was a really interesting thing that was in that episode. I like the idea of the 80-20 principle there, to be good. So it's like, I get trapped a lot by excellence. I can't actually remember if I've talked about 80-20 on the show before. I think I have, but I'll give a brief intro to it in a sec. If I'm trapped by excellence, which I am a lot, like, strength is striving for excellence. The weakness, the dark side of that strength is nothing will ever be excellent enough. You can spend as much time as you like, trying to create excellence. It's the problem with my 3rd book, which has just come out, How to Create the Conditions for Great Work. Really, in some ways, it should be the 4th book, in the 12-Minute Method series, because it's the thing you should do last. Think about creating the conditions for great work, because starting and keeping going and sharing some work are the most important conditions for great work. Everything else you do is, really can come later. But I just wanted the share book to come forth in the series. So that's why that's how that'll come. But 80-20 is a great way for me to think about things, to get out of my being trapped by trying to make things as excellent as possible, which is another way, a nicer way of saying I'm a perfectionist. And the 80-20 rule is basically, came from an Italian economist, I think, in the 18th century, Pareto, and he spotted that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. And then he spotted that this ratio showed up everywhere. A good way of thinking about that is you'll get 80% of the results on something from the first 20% of effort you put in. So when I'm writing an email to somebody, like by the time I've drafted it, I've done way more than 20% of the work, and it's definitely got more than 80% of the results that I want from the email. And I can spend another 4 times as much time on that email, proofreading it like a million times, but it'll only get 20% better. And I think that's true. If not, it's like 595, right? And I spotted that was one of the things I did in the podcast. It's like, I don't want to let go of excellence, but if I think, what are the like 20% of things I can do about this podcast to make it like 80% high quality? And that was like, buy a mic, record separate audio tracks, do a bit of editing, like a once over. But even that editing one, I could probably let go of. But I think it does mean that my podcast is a little bit more likely to stand the test of time. I won't be as embarrassed by it in a long time, but better to start than to even do those bits, right? And of course, the last two things that I saw from episode 9 were, how do I make it sustainable? So seeing that it wasn't sustainable and then thinking, 12-minute idea, if I keep going with this for 3 years, which is pretty much where I am now, that's better than not keeping going. What do I need to do that? And it was about energy. So like the zone of genius, zone of excellence piece. How do I delegate? How do I get help? And it was about time. So how do I like actually justify this time? And a part of that was, how do I make it part of my business? And that felt important with the podcast because it wasn't totally clear to me why I was doing it. And the Coach's Journey community was a really wonderful, there's a nice, I think I linked to it in the show notes of the last episode, nice reflection in a Coach's Journey podcast episode. I can't remember what number it is, like 18 maybe, about the way that in a way the podcast started to support one part of my business, but that didn't work. So I created a new part of my business, and that does basically work. And for now, it's continuing. Interesting other reflection was, though, when I started out, there weren't many other podcasts for coaches. I didn't know of any. There were some, it turns out, but I didn't know of them. Now there are loads after COVID, and I do sometimes wonder if the Coach's Journey podcast will reach an end point. But I love the Coach's Journey community calls too much to stop it, basically. And that's a great place to be, right? Because I love the conversations that I have with the podcast guests when I can get over my resistance to having them. So that is reflections on episode 9. Now we're going to get into reading. So here's the timer, and off we go. So one of the things people often say about me is, wow, you've read loads of books. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is, I remember where I've heard things. I often share where I've heard the thing with people. And so, and this comes up in my Clifton Strengths report. If you haven't done Strengths Finder or Clifton Strengths, it's cool, really great. The only psychometric test that I really recommend in my private business, for loads of great reasons. And one of my strengths that comes back in that is input. And so what I do is, I'm really good at collecting ideas, frameworks, things, and sharing with people at the right time. That's part of my strengths. But I often name that, and it used to be, I think, a way of like distancing myself from things out of a bit of fear of people not liking the idea. And now it's just that I realized I love sharing people's ideas and giving them credit. You'll have heard that if you've listened to multiple episodes of this show, even this one, right? I'm talking about Warren Buffett and James Clear and Pareto. And another reason that people say that I've read a lot of stuff is I have read quite a lot of stuff. So I love reading. I've loved it since I was a little boy. And I'm very happy that, mostly because of my wife, actually. My daughter Leah seems to love books. Books have enriched my life in so many ways. And I used to read non-fiction and fiction in kind of the same ways. It's like I'd read at lunchtime quite a lot. I'd read sometimes over breakfast. I'd read in the evening before bed, and I would just intersperse some fiction and some non-fiction into that. I was usually reading one, two or three books at once, but slowly. And that was fine, And I often use reading fiction. It's a way to recharge my energy, mostly. It's like an escape. It triggers different parts of my brain, switches my thinking off, so it's really good for me before bed. And in 2018, I was kind of ill. Like, no one ever named anything. The GP, the doctor's best guess was that I'd had like 3 or 4 viruses that ran together. And it was just bad luck. But it was months of feeling way below par, like way below. And when I'm physically below par, I'm mentally and emotionally can struggle as well. And what I found in this time was that all the times when I normally read, breakfast, lunchtime, before bed, I needed fiction to reading in that time to help me, to switch my brain off, to help me recharge, to stop me worrying. Because like I say, when I'm ill, I worry more. When I'm physically depleted, I get more anxious. And so I needed fiction reading for all those times. I was probably reading 2018. I think I might have been I often read fantasy novels, as you can guess from episode 2. I think I was reading The Wheel of Time, maybe even at that point, which is like a really epic fantasy series. But it might have been something different. But my energy was terrible. I just couldn't. I trusted my intuitions and how I felt, and I needed the fiction in those reading slots. I wasn't reading any non-fiction, but I knew that reading that was a big part of who I was. I wanted to be doing it on some level. It was like for my work, like with my clients, continually growing my thinking. Learning new things is a big part of how I work with people, but also another Clifton strength. For me, another one of my strengths is as a learner. So I'm at my best when I'm learning. And learning is a talent of mine, according to Clifton Strengths. And it feels like that in real life too. And here's the way I solved it. Now, I can't remember how this came about, but, it might have been from a coaching session, although I don't remember that explicitly. I don't know, maybe if it was early 2018, I may have not had... I don't think I'd started working with Katie yet, so maybe I was, still on a coaching program with Rich Litvin. And here's what I decided to do in the end. I decided that while I drank my morning coffee, on days when I was working from home, so on days when I was working from home, I would drink my morning coffee, right? And I would usually drink it while I was checking my emails or prepping for a session. I decided as I drank my morning coffee, I would read. Here we go. It's the training series all over again. I would read while I was drinking the coffee, stop when I'd finished the coffee. And I would basically decide that was enough reading. Now, particularly when I was stressed out, when I was really tired, when my energy and whatever this virus or this illness was at its height, I would sometimes read almost nothing, right? I would read like a couple of paragraphs over and over again while I drank the coffee, as my mind flew in all sorts of different directions, as my stressed thoughts came up, all that kind of thing. But that was enough. So it's like a story I heard from Seth Godin about the athlete Roger Bannister, who ran the first 4-minute mile. And Seth says, you can Google the Bannister method, you'll find the story. But Seth says the Bannister method is to obsess about doing just enough, not as much as possible. So again, I can feel the 12-minute method theme in this. The Duolingo theme is there too. It's like the best way to read nonfiction, as much nonfiction as possible, is to read quite a lot of nonfiction just every day. But I wasn't doing that. And better than reading no nonfiction was to read for the 10, 12, 15 minutes while I drink my morning coffee. I had to tweak my routine slightly to start fitting this in, but I did it. And I think my business was in a relatively quiet state at the time, so it felt possible to do that on most days. And that's basically how I've been reading nonfiction ever since. Pretty much just that. Occasionally when I'm doing a podcast interview with somebody and they've written a book, I'll find myself rushing to read it and reading it at night or scheduling in time to do it. But pretty much the only time I read now is read nonfiction. So read business books or psychology books or creativity books or whatever it is I'm reading. At the moment, I'm reading 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. And that's how I've been reading for the last, 4 years now, 4.5 years since the start of 2018. Now, I've read a lot of books in that time, not as many as I would have read if I was reading the other way, but I'm looking after myself, like by reading the fiction at the times that I want, and I love it. It's one of my favorite things to do, reading fiction. And reading nonfiction with my coffee is also one of my favorite things to do. So I get to do a wonderful thing most days. and I'm reading something. So I know that I'm always learning a bit. And here's an interesting thing. The first book that I read in that way was The Meaning Revolution by Fred Kaufman, which I absolutely love. One of my favorite leadership books. A very integrated, complete picture of leadership. Also incredibly practical and taps into some Eastern wisdom. So check that out if you're interested. Kaufman's a great thinker. And like, because I read it slowly, this practice has made me realize it's not necessarily true that the best way to read something is as fast as possible. So contrary to what I said before, if you want to read as much as possible, then you should read as much time as possible in the day. But if you want to absorb things, actually reading for 12 to 15 minutes a day might be better. I certainly meant that I had Kaufman's ideas, which, like I say, in that book are amazing, in my mind over something like a 6-month period. And there were all kinds of things that came from that. I used the ideas a lot with clients. Like, I wrote about them a lot when I'm reading my books, because they were written over, some of them were the articles in the books, the chapters in the books were written over this period. Kaufman comes up a lot because I was reading his book over that time. The same is later true with 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. And out of that came some of my best articles. The most read ever 12-minute article was a book inspired very much by The Meaning Revolution. And it's partly the most read one because Kaufman came across it and shared it and commented on it, how much he loved it. And that is still, one of the moments in my work that is like most meaningful for me. The amazing woman, Jacinta Jimenez, who I know from Better Up, Jacinta saw it, loved it, and shared it with Kaufman because she knows him. Her book is also great, by the way, The Burnout Fix. And so it's like, I learned that reading in that way is a really different way to read. And it's not necessarily better or worse. It does mean that I am accumulating books more than I used to. I get through things more slowly, much more slowly, but I think I learn more. And we get back to those 12-minute method principles. It's like, at the time, it didn't feel like perfect. Actually, now it does kind of feel like the perfect way to read nonfiction. Like, I might like to have an afternoon a week to do it, but in this moment, I'm not sure that I would. I think I learned from reading in this way, which was forced upon me really by being ill and my energy. I learned that actually this is almost the optimal way for me to read that kind of book anyway. What else do I want to say about this? And the most important thing, of course, is that I'm not reading, which is obviously important to me and my values. So this is interesting because I think this is the first time have I got to the end of that story before the timer's gone off. Listeners, what else is there about reading nonfiction? So there's a thing which is I still do read books. So Kaufman's book took 6 months because it's a dense book. There's a lot in it. Same with Jordan Peterson. But I have been through books much more quickly than that. I read a Steve Chandler book recently. Again, I rattled through it. I think I read about half of Jacinta's book in that way. I read half of Jennifer Garvey Berger's latest book recently in that way. But I was interviewing Jennifer, so I had to read that pretty quickly. So I didn't read it all in that way. But a shorter book, I do, and it also depends a little bit on my... So it's interesting because it is a habit tacked onto two things. So two things sometimes get in the way of this habit. If I'm not at home, if I'm going out to work out somewhere, I often don't do it because I'm kind of on the move and having my coffee when I get somewhere. And the other thing is, like, since Leo was born and I've gone to working 4 days a week... my work is a bit more concentrated. My days start a little bit earlier. And that's one of the ways I created space for a whole day with Leah. And so sometimes it does get squeezed. And like I say, I've basically made peace with that, which I think is one of the things I'm learning as I'm recording this episode. I've basically made peace with the fact that I will read more slowly than some people, but it doesn't really matter. Like I was saying to some people on a training course I was on, they were saying, like I said at the start of this section, I'm very well read. And it's like, but I've been reading books like this, for the last 10 years, and I've been reading them in this way for now, 4.5. So you do clock up the books. And you don't need to sound well read, you don't need to have read that many books. You just need to remember to talk about them. And there's the timer. And so, it's a really interesting one. I'm glad I remembered it. I have remembered another one about riding a bike. I'm not sure that'll take a whole episode, so I might just talk about it a bit next time, or maybe in the final episode of this series. And that's it for today. So look, I guess this is like one that I think some people will really may want to do. Like, this exact habit is a really good habit for reading. And whether you work in a company or you work for yourself, creating morning coffee time at the start of your working day to read something that helps you learn, that keeps your brain alive, that helps you grow and will help you in your work is a pretty powerful habit, a pretty powerful 12-minute type habit. And I guess the thing that I didn't mention is, because it was tagged to my morning coffee, which is something I do every day, it's hard for me to forget once I've started it. So once I had a few months of it built into my system, it's kind of every time I drink my morning coffee, I'm thinking, am I reading today? And the answer is yes, if possible, always. So everybody, have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time on the 12-Minute Method podcast, not the Coach's Journey podcast. See you next time, everyone. Okay, just a couple more things before you head out to whatever else you've got going on in the rest of your day. If you want to find out a bit more about me or sign up to my mailing list, you can do that at www.robbieswale.com. If you want to read the 12-Minute Method books, you can find out more about them on my website. You can find them on Amazon, and you can find them in lots of other bookshops and booksellers around the world. You might want to come and join the 12-Minute Method Facebook group. You can find that by searching for the 12-Minute Method on Facebook, or there's links on my website. And you can find some other people there who are interested in doing work that matters to them and finally doing the things that they want to do. You can find me on lots of social media platforms. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so you might want to find me there. And most of all, I'd love to hear from you, especially if something that I've made has inspired you to finally do something you've been meaning to do for a long time. Hearing those stories are some of the most meaningful things for me in my work. And so they help me keep going when I might want to give up. So I'd love to hear from you. But most of all, I'd love it if you did that thing that matters to you, that you've been meaning to do.